So that was an exciting transition to move out here. And it was the first time I'd ever worked for a very small company.
Right.
I worked for major corporations, and I went from, a several thousand person organization to a, 40-person organization. And
was it a culture shock?
I loved it.
Okay.
It was a culture shock, but it was a culture shock which I completely welcomed and loved, and got bitten by the startup bug and haven't been able to turn back since.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Health Technology Podcast. My name is Christine Winota, and I'm the director of the UCSF Roseman Institute at University of California, San Francisco. Today, we're talking to Niquette Hunt, president and CEO of Candesant Biomedical. Candesant Biomedical is developing a topical device to treat excessive sweating, a problem that affects more than 80 million Americans. Niquette did her undergrad in engineering and economics at Stanford, but got her first job as a brand manager at Procter & Gamble, where she launched the first product upgrade on Pert Plus shampoo. Even though she worked in marketing, she was still fascinated by innovation in engineering, and especially where the two sides meet, understanding the consumer needs. That continued throughout her career, which has involved several transitions. The biggest probably being when she moved from a very large company in New Jersey to a startup in Silicon Valley to help them develop a home cholesterol test. Since 2001, on top of her other industry roles, Niquette has also consulted for startups and large companies on marketing and commercialization in both medtech and biotech. I hope you enjoy our conversation as much as I did. And if you like what you hear today, please subscribe to our podcast on iTunes. The 2019 Roseman Innovators application is now open. The selected innovators will receive coaching and mentoring, variety of in-kind services, and the opportunity to pitch in front of our early-stage investors network. Deadline to apply is Thursday, April 18. And for more detailed information, go to our website, www.rosemaninstitute.org. Welcome. Thanks for coming and joining us for the podcast today on a rainy day here in San Francisco.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, so I thought it would be good to begin. You have quite a really interesting experience. You study economics and engineering at Stanford, and then you started your career in Procter & Gamble, and obviously now you're in the healthcare space. When you think about Procter & Gamble, people don't think about healthcare, but tell us more about how you get from Stanford to Procter & Gamble and then do what you're doing right now.
Sure. Again, thanks for having me. Many people think about Procter & Gamble, P&G, as a marketing company. At its heart, it's really a product company. And their goal is really to delight the consumer in any way, shape, or form from a product standpoint. And so that concept of product innovation that really delighted the customer or consumer was kind of inbred into me from the very first part of my career. And looking back, I realized that even in the early days of my career as a brand manager in marketing, I was always the brand manager who was poking around the R&D labs and making a nuisance of myself, trying to figure out how the technology worked.
I said because you have the engineering background. It's kind of interesting when you did you start at Procter & Gamble as a brand manager, being coming from engineer's background. That's quite unusual.
It is a little unusual, but I did start in marketing, and it's probably you probably nailed it right there. It was probably my engineer's background that caused me to poke around in the lab, even at an early stage, and was just fascinated by product innovation and the market research that got you to the way to delight a consumer, and then building a product to then meet that need. So the whole concept of talking to the consumer, understanding what the unmet needs were, and then building a product specifically to meet that need was something that was kind of grown into my DNA. I probably had a natural affinity for it, but P&G really helped make that blossom. Mm-hmm. And that was the most fun of my career, is launching new products and really understanding what made them tick and why they would be successful.
Were you stand in the supermarket talking to consumer? I'm just thinking about how different that is if you're trying to market to hospital doctors and what you're doing in Procter & Gamble.
Well, what's interesting is we didn't stand in the supermarket necessarily because I was in the healthcare, personal care space. So we tended to, if we eavesdropped, we tended to eavesdrop in their, their beauty vanities or things like that. But at the end of the day, the process is really similar, whether it's a personal care product or a healthcare product. You kind of either watch or listen to consumers tell you what bothers them and what they wish for in a product, because they won't necessarily tell you what I want in a product. They'll tell you what they're missing from their current regimen or their current needs. And then you can then decide this then would make you delighted and would really please you. And I think that's really the key and that's where P&G has historically done really well, is they have all these little surprises in relatively mundane products. I mean, Procter & Gamble makes everything from deodorants to shampoos to, washing detergents. But in each of these little product categories, there's something that goes, wow, I didn't think about that. And I'm so glad that you built that into the product. And that's what makes it, a lasting product brand.
Yeah, it's almost like as a consumer, sometimes you feel like, well, I did not know how much nicer to have. And now I cannot not have that.
Exactly. And that's the key to really building a long-term relationship with the consumer or the customer. And I think that's what really, I think, drives my passion for innovation, even in the healthcare space. It's a very, very different business, but the same types of insights and needs in the big picture really do exist across all categories. And it's really fun to, understand them and ferret them out.
So you were in Procter & Gamble doing a lot of the brand management, and then you moved to Warner & Lambert. Mm-hmm. And so that is continuation, but it's a different focus too. It
was a different focus. So in fact, it was doing a very similar functional job in a very different product category. So I went from, straight personal care products to more over-the-counter medicines. So at that time, I managed the cough, cold, and upper respiratory franchise, which is brands like Benadryl, Sudafed, and Actifed, which are still around today, of course. And so that was a transition from traditional, personal care items to over-the-counter goods, which then positioned me closer and closer to healthcare, which is, of course, eventually where I ended up.
Was it exciting? I mean, it must be exciting to see your product that you're working on is like in something that you see on the supermarket, places that you go, and when you're moving more away, closer to the things that touch the patient, you wish you never see it in your real life.
Well, I've actually been primarily, because of my consumer background, most of my healthcare experience has been in consumer-facing categories. And what I mean by that is categories in healthcare where the consumer or the patient makes either the majority of the buying decision or a significant portion of the buying decision. So in categories like diabetes, where many of the products are sold over the counter, or ophthalmology, where you're choosing either contacts or glasses, or of course dermatology, where many of the products are skincare products or products that you can get at a dermatologist's office and you're paying for them out of pocket. So in many cases, even though I am in healthcare, I can still see and touch a lot of my products today.
Yeah, there's so many different kind of healthcare, right? Mm-hmm. So you're at Warner Lambert doing brand management, mm-hmm. and then you were there for a while, and then you make another move to Chemtrack.
So I did. I moved out here to Silicon Valley to take a medical device, a home cholesterol test, over the counter. So that was my transition from traditional packaged goods or OTC medicines into medical devices. So that was an exciting transition to move out here. And it was the first time I'd ever worked for a very small company.
Right.
I worked for major corporations. And I went from, a several thousand person organization to a, 40 person organization. And
was it a culture shock?
I loved it.
Okay.
It was a culture shock, but it was a culture shock which I completely welcomed and loved, and got bitten by the startup bug and haven't been able to turn back since.
What do you like about it?
The most important thing for me in a startup world is the autonomy and the ability to wear multiple hats. the ability to really wear multiple hats and see your product really evolve from, in some cases, the research bench all the way to the consumer is pretty fascinating. And to have a hand in each of those processes and to actually see your touch, if you will, or your thoughts or your actions come to fruition in the actual product, I think that's extraordinarily exciting.
Yeah, I mean, and being in a large company, also they provide you a lot of good training. They have a good process, and somehow you need to know how to balance that and then transfer that knowledge to your startup hats.
You're very insightful, because P&G in particular is a great training company, and I feel like I left with a really great toolkit of skills and stayed there just long enough to get all the great training, but not to get too entrenched in the habits of, well, this is how it's been done for 30 or 40 years. So I got the best of both worlds, where you have the fantastic guideposts, but you weren't stuck in the mud or stuck in stone. So you really could blossom from there.
Right. And so obviously you have that inner thought to think like, this is time for me to move to something that's more where I can make a bigger impact in a startup world. Like what moment that you remember that this is something that I need to do right now? Because it's hard when, I'm sure you got a really good package working for a large company, great support to give it all up.
Looking back, it wasn't that tough of a decision. Again, at P&G, you get lots of great training. But over time, particularly for someone like me that does like to wear a lot of hats, you begin to feel constrained by the very systems that trained you to be so disciplined, then become somewhat of a constraint. So for me, it was kind of a natural transition. And, as I moved to Chemtrack and that company then got sold, as I was looking for the next job, I really tried to fashion or identify a job that really combined all of those aspects of, insights, market insights, and product development into a position. And it was really interesting. One of the things I found in Silicon Valley that was a little disappointing was this divide between the commercial side of the house and the development side of the house. And I really longed to unify those. And as I was looking for a position that really did unify them, I found that there wasn't really one position that did that. So I ended up starting a consulting practice that was able to combine those two worlds.
And so how do you do that? And is this something that you apply that to your clients? You kind of introduce that thinking to your client and then do that part.
That's exactly it. It's as a consultant, coming in from the outside, sometimes it's easier to listen to your commercial side and listen to your product development side, and then form a strategy to bring them together. And that's really where I excelled, is really understanding the marketplace, and whether it's interviewing doctors or interviewing patients or watching doctors and patients to really understand the habits and practices that would guide how they would use either the current products or the new products, and then form that kind of theory of what truly the unmet need was. And then similarly, listening to the engineers or scientists to really understand how the technology worked and what the best parts of that technology were, and then putting those two together in a very collaborative process. Because as a consultant, most of the time, I wasn't deeply entrenched in either the market or the technology. So as a new person with fresh eyes, I could come in and say, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? And trying to marry them together. And that's really where the practice began to really gain some traction. So in the initial years, I consulted primarily for companies right after they raised their B round of financing. So typically after they had, technical proof of concept, but they now had to build a product to meet the marketplace.
And the type of the companies that you consulted for are in the healthcare space or consumer product space?
They were actually right in the this intersection of healthcare and consumer. So, for example, in the diabetes space, I worked on several products that had OTC or home devices for either blood glucose monitoring or HbA1c monitoring. In the ophthalmology space, I worked on products that were self-pay for vision correction. Mm-hmm. And then when I eventually moved into the dermatology space and the aesthetic skincare space, I worked for several biotech and medical device companies that were in the kind of rejuvenation or aesthetic space.
Mm-hmm. Because you were at Biomedical and then to Revance, mm-hmm. and your role has always been in the marketing role. So you're doing that at the same time you're doing consulting, or?
That's a really good question.
Or you met them through your consulting work?
I met them through my consulting work. And one of the things that I tried to do as a consultant is make it almost invisible to the company that I was actually not a part of the team. So in many cases, most of the people there, except probably the person who was paying my salary, thought I was part of the team, because it was really important to me to integrate as both an insider but an objective eye, and I was able to kind of, make that balance. The other practical part of it was I didn't really view myself as a consultant. I viewed myself more as an operating person. Mm-hmm. And I really longed to be back as part of a team. So in the back of my mind, I always knew that I would eventually join one of my clients. And that's eventually what happened. I joined Revance Therapeutics after consulting with them for probably about 5 years.
Okay, and you were there for a while. That's how you met your co-founder at the Candesant. Mm-hmm. So tell us more about your work at Revance, and because you have a good exit.
Sure. I was at Revance for the better part of 10 years, actually, working on their full portfolio of products. And at the time, Revance is working on alternatives to botulinum toxin. And we really had to understand what the unmet needs were in that space, because there was, of course, a very entrenched competitor and still is a very entrenched competitor. So in order to be a nimble and quick startup company, you have to really understand what are the open spaces that competitor doesn't really fill as well as your new product could. So really had a great opportunity to understand that space and really identify the key open areas that Revance could really innovate in. And our technology, Revance's technology at the time, really did that.
This podcast is sponsored by IO Life Science, a Silicon Valley-based medtech design and development consultancy, transforming your technologies into unique healthcare solutions. For more information, you can visit their website at www.iolifescience.com. And so you met your current co-founder, Jacob, for Candesant, your current company that you're starting with your time when you're at Revance. Can you tell us more about?
Absolutely. Even though I was on the commercial side of the business and Jacob was on the scientific side of the business, in the early stages, those two really need to work very closely together because, as I mentioned before, the marriage of what the market needs and what the technology does is the key to building a great product. So Jacob and I started working closely together almost, at the very first time we met, and we spent the better part of 10 years working. I spent the better part of 10 years working at Revance. He was there longer because he was one of the co-founders. So we developed this incredibly strong working relationship and respect for one another. So when it was time for both of us to move on, we knew we wanted to continue to work together. And that was one of the key, identifying factors of Candesant is not only did we have an interesting market need and an interesting technology, but a group of people who wanted to continue to work together.
Yeah, that's really nice. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more what you're working on Candesant, like what's the technology, what is the target market that you're trying to solve the problem for?
Sure. Candesant, as I mentioned, is really a company that was built to alleviate the suffering of the 84 million Americans who sweat too much, who really feel like they are bothered on a daily basis by excessive sweating or perspiration. And while that's certainly not a life-threatening condition, it's one that's really significantly negatively impacting their quality of life. So of these 84 million people, 70% of them have to alter their lifestyles to cope, whether they wear different clothes or avoid shaking hands or avoid being in public. It really limits their activities.
What is the current option right now for these people?
The current options are pretty limited. I mean, because traditional antiperspirant that you buy on the over-the-counter market doesn't really work that well for this 1/3 of Americans, those 84 million people. For most people, for 2/3, it works perfectly fine. But for this group of folks, it doesn't work well enough. And there's certainly some invasive treatments. There's, injections. There's, surgery that are really invasive and have lots of downtime, or there's medications that have side effects. And one of the key consumer insights and how the product was built is that when you have a problem that's bothersome, you don't want to trade it for another problem that's bothersome. So if you have a quality of life issue, like you're constantly sweating and your clothes are soaking, you don't want to trade that for another annoying problem like dry mouth or dry eye, which is one of the side effects of some of the medication. So the consumers of these types of conditions tend to be pretty intolerant of side effects. So as we were thinking about what was the right product for these group of consumers, how could we really meet this need, we knew that it had the product that we built had to be really effective. It had to be relatively pain-free and relatively quick to administer. It had to be something that had no downtime. And then from a practical standpoint, because it was going to be delivered in the doctor's office, it had to be something that the physicians could make money at, as well as be very economical for the consumer to purchase out of pocket. So it had to have all of these factors. And Jacob had developed a technology that was uniquely suited towards excessive sweating.
So was the technology come first, or do you guys identify this area, the market, that you think that there's potential, unmet need that needs to be solved? I mean, which one come first?
Good question about the chicken and the egg. And that's the beauty of having two people who come at it from very different perspectives. So from the commercial side of the business, I had really identified, wow, this is an interesting market space. From the technical side of the business, Jacob was solving all kinds of technical problems. And as we started to discuss what product ideas we might have for our future brainstorming, the combination of, wow, this is a need, and wow, this technology seems to uniquely fit that need really came together. So it's not often that happens, where you have a really strong identified consumer and patient need that you know deeply about, and you have a technology that has already been built that uniquely fits that need. So we were very fortunate in having the two disciplines come together with both a commercial bent and a scientific bent to form this product.
That's great. Sometimes you have this technology and waiting for problem to solve, and so it's just nice to have. It's always good to have different perspective in the team, I think. And so, where are you now with the technology? Is this something that you have put in patients already, or?
We are actually in the process of moving to the next phase of development. We've developed our prototypes, and we actually had our first clinical data read out this past fall, where we showed pretty definitively that we were able to reduce sweating in a significant portion of patients for a significant period of time. So our target audience are consumers who think they sweat too much, and there's a clinical definition of people who sweat too much, and those folks were entered into the trial.
What is considered as clinically sweat too much mean?
So there are several measurements. Most of them are patient-reported outcomes because, as you can imagine, the most important measurement of both success or failure is does the consumer feel like they have a problem, and does the consumer feel like the problem is solved? So there are technical measures of how you measure sweat, but the most important factor is really that consumer measure of satisfaction, or I don't feel like my sweat bothers me anymore. So the people who started in the study were those who felt like they were really bothered by their sweat, and we were able, after a single treatment, and the treatment only takes about 10 minutes in the doctor's office, to deliver a significant reduction of sweating for about 6 to 8 weeks. So a single treatment that took 3 minutes in the office lasted for about 8 weeks and had a dramatic reduction in sweat.
That's great. Do you want your startup to receive coaching and mentoring, a variety of in-kind services, the opportunity to pitch in front of early-stage investors, and be showcased at the 2019 Rosamond Symposium at UCSF? If so, application is now open for the 2019 Rosamond Innovators. Deadline to apply is Thursday, April 18. And for more information, please go to rosamondinstitute.org. Can you tell us more about, how does it work, or how does it being applied to the patients? If I were the patient, what do I expect?
Sure.
How painful it is, or not painful.
Exactly. Our goal was to really deliver something that was easy to use for both the office and easy to tolerate for the patient. So we deliver our product actually in a patch that is about the size of an underarm, because the first indication is underarm sweating. So we deliver a topical patch that looks not dissimilar to a very large bandage. And in the office, the doctor peels off the backing, places it on the underarm. The patient feels a sensation of warmth, and then a little bit of pins and needles. The patch stays on for about 3 minutes, and then it's taken off and discarded. And with that 3-minute treatment, you get a efficacy of sweat reduction for about 6 to 8 weeks.
And then they'll come back for another treatment.
And then they'll come back for another treatment.
So is there a reason, besides there's this, the recurring patient, is there a reason why that is desirable not to have a permanent solution, that you don't have to ever come back?
Many people get nervous with permanent changes to their bodies. In some cases, I'm sure there are some, permanent solutions to hyperhidrosis or excessive sweating, but they tend to be more destructive, more downtime, and people, as I mentioned, aren't willing to make the trade-offs. So we offer the best of both worlds. We give long-lasting effect with a very simple, easy to administer, and easy to tolerate treatment.
Yeah. And so it's interesting also that this is considered as cosmetic in the dermatology office. So is patient pay for it? And can you tell us, because it's interesting, when we think about healthcare, oftentimes we think about reimbursement, but when it comes to this space, it's out-of-pocket payment. How is it different from other?
So I think that it's partially a strategic choice by the company to really try to meet the broadest consumer need, because within the 84 million people who are bothered by excessive sweating, there's a subset, and that subset's not tiny, but it's not the majority of people. There's a subset of about 15 million people who sweat so much it's considered a disease. But we wanted to make sure that we built a product that would really satisfy that broader population that may or may not have access to reimbursement because they're not defined as the disease state itself. So it was important to us to meet that consumer need. And one of the barriers potentially would be the reimbursement, because then you'd have to qualify as having a disease state in order to get the treatment. And we didn't want that. So we purposely tried to price the product in a very attractive way so that people could be able to afford it.
And so you're comparing to what's existing currently in the market and what's the reimbursement for people the 15 million. So you were saying right now 15 million of people get reimbursed for this sort of treatment. Is that right, roughly?
Well, 15 million people have the disease state of hyperhidrosis. Sometimes they get reimbursed and sometimes they don't. As you can imagine, as reimbursement starts getting more and more difficult to obtain, conditions that tend to be less life-threatening tend to be less well reimbursed. So it's not always that the people who have the disease state can even get reimbursed. So it was really important to us to have a treatment that would be affordable for the larger group of folks. So whether you had the disease state of hyperhidrosis or you simply thought you sweat too much and were very bothered by it, you could still afford the treatment. And from a commercial standpoint, what we tried to do is look at other similar treatments in the physician's office that were what we're calling entry-level procedures. So relatively inexpensive procedures compared to some of the other things that are done in the office so that they'd be affordable for consumers.
And these products still have to get an FDA approved to get to be all the good things all the hard things that a company needs to go through. So that's great. Maybe I always ask my guests in terms of, when you look back when you started, obviously you worked for Procter & Gamble. Do you ever thought one day that you did start a consulting company, so it's, in a way you've been entrepreneurial, and so. Yeah, where do you get that idea that I want to start a company and run a company?
For me,
who inspired you, I guess?
For me, it was really organic in that it's really important to me in my career to keep growing and learning. And I had a wonderful career as a consultant. And part of the reason that I transitioned to a new role and joining a company when I joined Revance was that I felt like I was repeating myself. I got really, really good at a certain set of project types and kept repeating those. Because, when you're good at something, people want you to do it over and over again. And while it was super exciting for many years, it became too rote. And so I moved to Revance for a new challenge and had a fantastic time really learning, because I was at such an early stage biotech and had such a close working relationship with the scientific side of the house, that I was able to really grow my skill set on the development side. And as, that product progressed through the development cycles, I wanted to spread my wings even further. And so for me, it was a natural transition to build my skill set from a commercial side, from a product development side, to then take it and put it all together in a new company. So it wasn't necessarily something that I dreamed of from the first time I started my career. But as I look back, it was a pretty natural progression, because I'm really good at creating things and innovating around new products and new ideas and thoughts. And so this was a natural evolution for me.
Yeah. So you mentioned about, the love of learning. And I found that sometimes, how do you instill that in young people, right? Because especially, I'm a parent, and we're a completely different generation. When I grew up, my parents just let us run loose. And now it's not like that environment anymore. But how do you instill the love of learning, not just for youngsters, but also your team, right? Because I think you want that kind of people in your team. How do you do that?
I think the most important way to teach is by example, particularly both when you're thinking of your team and when you're thinking of parenting. It's important to say, but it's more important to do and live. And so what I try to do is constantly be in a state of inquiry and not taking concepts as given. Why is that the case? How is that the case? Why do we think that? Is it still the same? Has it changed? Has the market changed? Has the technology evolved? Constantly questioning, I think, instills in the team that idea that we're not standing still. We're always willing and able to kind of challenge our assumptions, because in the fast-moving startup world, what was right last week may or may not be right this week. I mean, both the market and the technology, but our surrounding environment is always changing. And if you're not adapting to your environment, you could potentially be building something that's wonderful, but doesn't hit the mark from a market standpoint. So you constantly have to be questioning and encouraging your team to question and to make sure that we're always on the right track. So I think that that example of inquiry is really an important factor in a learning team, and and modeling that behavior is really important as a leader.
Yeah, no, I think that you said it so well. I just not, sometimes you do it so naturally, not thinking, but you put a lot of deliberate into the behavior that you're doing. I think that's really important. This podcast is sponsored by IO Life Science, a Silicon Valley-based medtech design and development consultancy, transforming your technologies into unique healthcare solutions. For more information, you can visit their website at www.iolifescience.com. I always like to ask people also is what's your childhood like? Where do you grow up? Because I think it says a lot about who we are, because somebody told me the first 7 years of your life, kind of shape a little bit of what you're, who you are, which I don't know if that is true or not, but I'd like to believe so.
Well, I had a wonderful childhood. I was actually born in New York in the United States, but both of my parents are Jamaican. And I grew up very much as a Jamaican child, and in fact moved back to Jamaica when I was 6. So not quite 7, but 6. And so I had a very kind of international upbringing, because even when I lived in New York, I was always in Jamaica with my grandparents and grew up very close to my grandparents and very close to my mother and her family. And so I very much grew up in an environment of extended family and lots of extended family that was very secure.
That sounds like a lot of fun.
And a lot of fun. Growing up in Jamaica in the, when I did was a lot of fun for sure.
I think I found that when you're young, you have a lot of cousins to run around with. It's really fun. I mean, I had that growing up, and I felt like, wow, it's nice. Not everybody have that luxury.
That's very true. My mother was one of 5, and she continues to be very close with all of her siblings. And as a result, all of her siblings' kids were very close. And I'm an only child. So I tease and say that I had the best kind of siblings, the siblings that went home. Because I had so many cousins and I was very, very close to them. I got the best of both worlds.
That's a good point. I'll remember that. So, okay. You have a lot of experience, being in a large company and a startup and leading a company, leading a team. What are the, if you could think of 3 advice throughout your career and life that you remember, that you're always drawn to, if you can share that.
Sure. One of them, I think, is really dreaming big and not letting go of it. Because particularly as an entrepreneur, you have to dream big. And you have to cling to that, and you have to believe it, even when you don't. Even when you're like, should I really believe this? The answer is absolutely yes. And that unshaking belief in what you're doing and why you're doing it is critical. Because as you know, the startup world isn't easy, and you're always going to face challenges. Unless you're really grounded in the vision for what you're building and why you're building it, and making sure you're holding on to that, you're going to get shaken. And it's planting your beliefs in some bedrock that are really going to get you through the hard times. So number 1 is dream big and believe it even when you don't. The second one is really surround yourself with a village. And I think that it's mentors and advisors are critically important, but a lot of people talk about mentors and advisors. What I have found to be the difference for me as a CEO is peers that know what you're going through and can really bolster you up in those bad times and celebrate you in those amazing times, because it's a unique seat that you sit in as a founder CEO. And a lot of people say that it's a lonely seat, and it is. And it's difficult to imagine how lonely that seat is until you sit in it. And so for me, it's been really critical to have peers that I know well that have sat in that seat and really can relate to what I'm going through. And, I'm astounded how long-term relationships so matter in this business. People who I've known for 25 years are still impacting me on a day-to-day basis. And it really pays to keep in touch with people and to establish a village wherever you are and make sure you are keeping those connections going over time and over, in many cases, distance.
Yeah.
And I guess the last one, and it goes back to what we were talking about, a learning team, but also sitting in the CEO role, is really making sure as a leader, you're always listening. You're always really hearing what your team is saying. But at the end of the day, you're the one who's making the call. And to be really mindful of those kind of factors. You got to listen. You got to make sure that you hear and people feel like they're heard. But at the end of the day, you're making the call. And sometimes you say, I'm making the call that you make the call. But at the end of the day, you got to know who's in charge. And I think that's what really gives the team a bit of an anchor as well, to say, this isn't a ship that's being tossed about. This is a ship that is anchored. There's a purpose, there's a goal, there's a mission. We're heading towards it. And that's really, really important.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great one. Well, one last question before I let you go. I'm doing a book competition with my son, so I'm always looking for a book's idea. And any good book that you read last year that you want to share?
So the last book I read, which I do recommend, it's called The Hacking of the American Mind. It's written by actually a UCSF professor.
Okay.
Robert Lustig, I think.
Yeah.
And it's just a fascinating account of how how our brains and bodies work, and how the impact of certain behaviors and certain habits and practices have an impact on our overall happiness. And it's been a kind of an eye-opening book for me. I'm actually having my children read it.
Oh, okay. Well, that's a good one. Okay. Well, that's good. Thank you so much. It's been so fun to hear your story, and looking forward to hear your progress that you make with Candesant.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This was absolutely delightful to chat with you.
Thank you.